I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement that we live in a golden age of the web platform. Every now and then, there's an article which comes and does the rounds, which states that the web is dying or already dead. And I really disagree with this. CSS Grid, Flexbox, variable fonts, service workers, the tools we need to build progressive web applications. We have very powerful building blocks at our disposal. This is not the sign of a web dying. This is the sign of a web which is very much alive and thriving. We have these web standards coming in browser at a faster rate than ever before. The process is more transparent than ever before. The gaps are narrowing. We also have access to a litany of frameworks and libraries. And while there is cause to feel overwhelmed, I know, I need to acknowledge that we have a tremendous amount of choice out there with which to build our tools. And to get us through that, we have at our disposal a lot of developer tools, from build tool chains all the way to DevTools and browsers. And acknowledging the differences, I could still say that DevTools in all browsers today provide a robust toolkit that empower web developers to create for the web platform. Web developers. What about web designers? My name is Razvan, and today I want to talk about DevTools for web designers. I'm a software engineer at Mozilla. I work on Firefox DevTools, and previously to this, I worked on a bunch of things at Adobe, like CSS Shapes, regions, masking, blend modes, and many other things that never actually made it. And throughout my career, I've always been interested in the sort of tools we can provide for these powerful new features. Now, it's good to begin with a bit of backstory of how we got to this point. Firebug was a very, very popular Firefox extension which revolutionized the way we develop. It itself was inspired and it competed with the sort of tools like Venkman or DOM Inspector. What set apart Firebug was a community of enthusiast developers from multiple different companies, an ecosystem of extensions, and a driven group of people who wanted to build better tools right into the context of the browser, so we could get inspection, debugging, and many other things. Firebug was a pioneer in developer tools, and it is the pioneer on which many dev tools are based today. When it comes to web design features, the pioneer I would like to point at is Dablet, a CSS playground built by Leah Veru. And what sets apart Dablet is this very interesting way of showing property previews on CSS properties that you can see over here. Leah collected some of the examples existing at the time, and she brought in some of her own and collected them all into Dablet for us to use. It serves as an inspiration for DevTools, and it sometimes makes me sad that today we have DevTools which do not yet match Dablet in expressiveness. OK. But what do web designers actually need in order to design in the browser? And I think it's good to make the distinction what I mean by web designers, and that is people who predominantly use CSS and HTML in their work. Not to say that they don't use JavaScript, but their work is primarily in CSS and HTML. Well, I think there are a few key principles that DevTools would need to solve in order for people to truly design in the browser. These are things like the free-form canvas, where you can explore ideas in an unhindered manner with less structure to worry about. The confidence that your changes will not be lost and you can undo them. Web designers also need specialized tools for the sort of problems they solve. A simple form with input fields is not enough. And they also want their tools to be flexible and customizable to fit the way they work. So let's get into it. Freedom. And by freedom here, I mean bringing in some of the creative freedom that people have in tools like Photoshop or Sketch, where it's very easy to start designing something and let your creativity flow and allow for those serendipitous moments when you stumble upon a design you really like. That's not to say that it's impossible to do with DevTools or to create this in the browser in code today. It's just that it's a lot less expressive and a lot less conductive to experimentation to write code when you want a solution, as opposed to just free-form editing. And no DevTools actually solve this today because this is a very complex problem to solve. Because well, the web is built over very many years, and it has to be backwards compatible, and it has to lend itself to progressive enhancement. But one tool which comes close to this is Webflow. Now, Webflow is a tool, an online editor for creating websites in a completely manual way, just dragging things around and using specialized editors. This is a video I pulled from their website, which highlights some of the functionality you have there. It's a lot more expressive, and it's a lot more fast to get to results with Webflow. But even it, which exports good quality code from the editor, it needs to fit into their CMS ecosystem, and it needs some form of structure in order to build these things. So you don't have true free capabilities to put things wherever you want. You still have some form of limitations in structure, but it's getting very close. So while the freedom aspect of DevTools isn't solved in a general sense, I do believe that per component, we can still have tools which give you free-form editing capabilities. Next up is confidence. Now picture this. You're doing a design in Photoshop. You make some changes. You made a mistake. There's no way to go back. Or you accidentally refresh the tool, and all of your changes have gone. Well, sadly, that is the situation in many of the DevTools today. The changes are very ephemeral. You come in, make some tweaks, you refresh the page, they're gone. And that's not something you can use as a professional tool if you don't have control over these tweaks. Changes are happening, though. There's a new feature launched recently in Chrome called local overrides. And what local overrides does is it tracks changes happening in DevTools, writes them to a file, and then reapplies them every time you refresh the browser, so you don't lose changes anymore. Here's a video of it in action in Chrome. So you find it under the Sources panel. There's the Overrides subpanel over there. First, you need to select the folder where you would save the changes, the whole file changes. Once you allow this, you can return to your normal workflow in DevTools. So you can start making changes to properties, and the browser will start monitoring those changes, and it essentially saves an entire copy of the file to disk. So then, when you refresh, even hard refresh, like clearing the cache, you always get your changes back from that file on disk. There's an indicator next to the network panel saying, hey, by the way, we may be overwriting properties. As soon as you disable DevTools, you're back to the normal website. When you re-enable DevTools, local changes are always reapplied. So essentially, it's taking the local file and using it instead of whatever's coming from the server, which is great, but there's a caveat. If you forget this thing open, you may not know why your dev changes are not applying on your machine. So there's a caveat there, which you need to be mindful. And the indicator next to the network panel is a hint there. An alternative to local overrides is a Chrome Developer Tools extension called Finch Developer Tools. And it does pretty much the same thing. You have to explicitly enable it. There's no folder to save. And then once you enable Finch, you can start making changes to your styles and DevTools as usual. Finch monitors these changes, and it saves them into memory. Every time you refresh the page, it goes to memory and brings those changes back. You have this panel in DevTools called Finch, which shows you a diff of everything you've done. You can toggle the diff on or off so to remember what changes you made, and you can also export these changes. And the difference with Finch is that you can export just the subset of changes you made instead of having a huge file saved locally to disk. Finch is cool. Next up, it's specialized tool, and there's a lot to talk in specialized tools. And by this, I mean editors focused on doing one thing and doing it very, very well. And probably the classic example in specialized tools is the color picker. The color picker in Chrome, I'm probably convinced everyone has seen it before. You start inspecting an element, you find a color value, and you trigger the color picker over there, and you make changes to the hue, see your changes live in the page. This is powerful because we want contextual changes. But I don't know if you've noticed recently, there's this recent addition of contrast ratio in the color picker, which when you expand, tells you if the colors you're picking are actually compliant with accessibility guidelines, which make text easier to read for people who have difficulty reading text of different colors. Once you change colors, you actually get a line over there, and it shows you the threshold above which colors are not considered compliant with the standards, AA or AAA. And I particularly like this integration of accessibility right into the tool when you're developing, as opposed to having an accessibility step later down the road. It brings the importance of the field up close and personal. I like this. Next up, the text shadow editor, also in Chrome DevTools. I don't know if you've noticed this because it's very subtle, but in the styles panel of Chrome DevTools, there's a hamburger or meatball menu, and it gives you a couple more options to add properties. And one of these options is adding the text shadow. Now, this gives you, again, a specialized editor, which gives you a lot more flexibility in playing around with the shadow, changing the direction of it or the spread or the blur, which, again, lends itself to creativity, to exploration, to figuring out what works and what doesn't. Next up, the CSS Grid Inspector. I had a preview of this. People love CSS grids because they're an amazing new layout tool, and they need help designing with grid. So CSS Grid is actually being used on the website conference right now. And the Grid Inspector gives you a preview of the grid, so you can inspect where the elements are actually positioned on that grid. Now, here's a more complex example built by my colleague Jen Simmons, where the need for the Grid Inspector really comes handy, because you want to know where these elements are positioned on the grid. You can toggle the display line numbers to see lines for columns and rows, and you can extend the lines infinitely if that helps you or not. And a cool thing is you can change the color of the grid, so maybe you have more contrast if it doesn't work well with your design, and this setting is maintained after you refresh the page. So I know for a fact that this demo is also responsive, and when you make changes, this is where the inspector comes in very handy, because some elements may have repositioned, and then you can see them on the Grid Inspector, and you can understand what changed in your layout. This is an invaluable tool if you're learning grid or if you're playing with grid, because it can get very complex, and having a specialized preview in the Grid Inspector is really useful for people. CSS filters in Firefox, they have an editor in Firefox DevTools. They're really cool ways of changing the graphic of something, the styling. So over here, we're using the filter editor to add a hue rotate, and we're dragging against that label over there to pick up colors for hue rotate. And then we can also add, for example, brightness. So we can stack multiple filters together. And what makes this very powerful is that instead of writing the values manually, you can play around with them, and you don't need to know their limits, their constraints. We can also add saturation to see what desaturation does. And an important thing about filters is that their order is important. So you can change the order in the editor, and you can live preview that on the page to understand the subtle differences that are actually happening when you're doing that. One thing which is not shown in the video is that you can also save these filter presets, so you can reapply them next time you want to edit. Next up, the CSS Gradient Editor. We have a gradient editor integrated into Safari DevTools. Wherever you see a linear, radial, or repeating linear or radial gradient, you get a contextual editor to do this. And this is shown on a website called gradient.com, which is a playground for choosing gradients or creating them online and getting the for them. There are a lot of gradient editors out there. People are trying to solve this problem in many different ways, and it's really good to have a lot of different opinions. One very cool gradient editor that I found recently is one for easing gradients built by Andreas Larsson. So Andreas Larsson suggested introducing a concept of easing to your gradients, much like we have in animation. So you don't have a straight gradient, you can have a curve. And he built this specialized editor to represent what that would mean. This is a CSS working group proposal now, and you can use the editor to understand the intent. You can change the angle of the gradient. You can change colors. One cool feature which I like a lot is using steps. So you have a stepped linear gradient over there. And I love this tool so much because it's so focused on letting you explore different things. I have literally spent hours playing with this tool. And yes, it doesn't solve all problems for Grid, but this is a prime example of a tool doing one thing and doing it very well while encouraging creative exploration. I really, really like this. All right, enough of video demos. Let's switch to some code. This is something being developed right now in Firefox Nightly, and it's called the font editor. So for this, I'm going to switch over and open up the Firefox DevTools. I'm showing this whole presentation in Firefox Nightly, by the way. And we built this thing called the font editor, which is an extra panel over here in the sidebar that allows you to edit things for fonts. Like you can change the size. Sorry, we need to inspect the element. And then we need to not have our demo crash on stage. Bear with me. Sorry. That's why it's behind the flag right now. OK, finally got it working. So this is behind the flag in Firefox Nightly because it has bugs. It won't have too many bugs soon enough. OK, so what we can do with the font editor, we can inspect an element, and then we can change the size of it. We're pretty used to this, or we can make it italic or not. But the font editor is particularly built for helping you use variable fonts. And variable fonts are very, very cool, because they change the way we use fonts in our website. Instead of downloading multiple font files for bold or thin or italic, variable fonts include information in the font file that allows the browser to generate bold, italic, or many different things with things called axes. And what the font editor does, it goes and reads the font file and gives you access to those axes. So we're changing here the weight of our font over here. And you can probably see that the font weight doesn't go up in increments of 100. You can have much more fine-grained control depending on the font author. We can also change the width of the font. Now check out what happens with the Q over there. We can pick various positions on the axes of, say, width or weight that suit our website well. And these are called registered axes, which means they're expected to be there for most variable fonts. They're not compulsory, but they're expected. But the very, very cool thing about variable fonts is that you can build custom axes into the font file as an author. And we can expose those in the font editor. For example, over here, we can change the ascender height. So the ascender is basically making our Ks, our Bs, our Fs a lot taller or smaller. Or we can change the serif height, which is maybe a bit more subtle to see on stage, but it definitely works in tweaking the font to your desired behavior. What makes this very powerful is that in order to do these things with variable fonts, you have to read the font file, read the documentation, and know that these custom axes exist. I'm going to turn on a mode called 3-pane mode here in Firefox so we can see what's happening. So the actual notation you need to write by hand is this thing called in font variation settings. It's a bit cryptic, honestly, if you want to write this. So the font editor comes really handy when you want to do these things and explore and just drive-by exploration of variable fonts on the web. So we're working on this in Firefox Nightly. It's behind the flag, thankfully. But this and variable fonts are coming very, very soon. And if you're interested in variable fonts, this is a website I recommend you go check out. Axis Praxis by Lawrence Penny is a playground for variable fonts, which does pretty much the same way as our font editor. It gives you the axes so you can play with them. But with the font editor, you can go on any website and have those axes work for you. That was the font editor. Next, the shape path editor. This is an editor for helping you use CSS Shapes and clip path notation in a very visual way. So over here, I'm going to turn on this demo again. And what's probably very visible is that I have my text wrapping around the tree over there. And the way it's doing that, it's using a CSS property called shape outside, which is changing the shape of the float rectangle. So we have our text wrapping around the tree. But the notation is pretty crazy. That's a polygon definition over there, which I doubt anyone would write by hand. So for this, we have the CSS shape path editor. We can enable it by clicking over here, and then we get an overlay of an editor, so we can drag these points around. Thank you. So we can drag these points around, we could double-click to remove them, and we can see our changes happening contextually on the page. And this is important because stuff in HTML interacts. You need to do this on the page so you can understand what's going on. Now here's a trick. We can hold down the Control key on Windows or the Command key and press this thing, and now we get a transforms editor, which allows us to change the entire shape up and down. We can also rotate this shape. We can scale it. Many crazy different things. This is working for shape outside properties right now. But it also works for clip paths, because they use the same value notation. And what's an Alice in Wonderland demo without the Cheshire Cat? Well, the Cheshire Cat has always been watching us from up here. I can reveal it by inspecting this element, which has a clip path of circle, and it's very small. But as I drag this handle over here, I can reveal we were actually clipping an element. Thank you. We're actually clipping this element with a clip path. And again, the notation for circle is relatively easy, but you can imagine this being very handy for polygons, which it also works for. An extra thing you see over there is the rectangle. That is informing you of the extent of the element which would be clipped. So you understand if, say, for example, you don't see why clipping doesn't happen outside of it. That's your representation. So these are tools that we're building to empower you to play with features right into the browser, specialized tools. Now, CSS Shapes is, I think it's done in Firefox, and it's imminent. Like, the release is imminent. Next couple of weeks, I believe. So Shapes are coming in Firefox, and the shape editor launching at the same time. Let's switch over to the last part, which is ergonomics. And this means that people really love tools when they can customize them to suit the way they work. People work in many different ways throughout our industry. And that's probably not news to you. But what maybe is news is that the developer tools team in any browser you know has very few people working on it. And there's generally very few people maintaining code base for a large audience. Some of us are very thankful to have contributors, like volunteers we have at Mozilla, who fix bugs and who even implement features altogether. And we're really thankful for their effort. But the reality is, we all need to work against some priorities. And sometimes those priorities may not be the same thing you care about. And when people want something built, they just go ahead and do it. So I was really happy to learn earlier this month that React DevTools, a Chrome DevTools extension, now has over 1 million users. As much as we love React and DevTools, I think it's hard to imagine that anyone would prioritize building DevTools for React into DevTools, knowing how transient and how ever-changing frameworks are. But that didn't stop people who were motivated and skilled enough to build these tools and share them with others. They recognized the need, and they built a tool for it, and it's popular. And this is the power of building extensions. So at this point, I should just encourage all of you to go build DevTools extensions for web designers. Well, I could do that. Well, you can get a panel added to your DevTools, like my extension over there. Or you can get a sidebar panel placed next to the rules over there. Or if you're using 3-pane mode in Firefox, you can have the rules panel separate, and you have a design surface next to it. So you can maybe make changes and see those changes happening in the rule view. But if that panel looks very lonely and empty, it's because it is. In reality, DevTools extensions are very isolated. They know almost nothing about the DevTools environment, and they have a very loose connection with the inspected page through a rudimentary text-based protocol. So if you want to build DevTools, for designers, you don't actually have access to the rule view. You don't know which rules have applied to that element. You don't know if the node is changing, if the media queries have changed. You don't know if the DevTools has closed underneath your feet. That's kind of weird. So if you want to build DevTools extensions right now, you have to do a lot of work just to get to the point where you can start building your specialized editor. Now, that's not a good way of working. So here comes a proposal. What if we could change that? What if we can write extension APIs that allow you to plug into the rule view and subscribe with a specialized editor for a property? Say you just want to write an editor for font weight, which has a slider with notches over there and maybe a drop-down to pick one of the instances. And you're really interested just in font weight. You should be able to give the browser this extension and let the browser show it next to the properties which matter. The browser should do the legwork of finding the rules, showing your editor, closing your editor, sending events in if the node has changed, and sending events in if the property was overwritten by something else. But there's no real reason why we should only expose this to one editor at a time. We could have multiple editors per property, multiple color pickers per property. The example I showed earlier from Andreas Larsson's gradient editor, it does one thing very, very well. It doesn't need to do everything once you have a canvas where you can actually have multiple people designing different editors for different functionality. And there's also no need to have only one editor open at the same time. You can have multiple editors, each one of them specialized, and use these in tandem to get the results that you actually want. So we can have a font size editor, which allows you to see if what you're picking is not legible or not, or margin, which does shorthand expansion over there. These would be inline editors and give you the freedom to really focus on something you want to implement, a specialized editor. But we can also open up the previews, so we can have previews of angles. And this is a demo built by one of my colleagues, Nicolas. We can get closer to that vision Leah had with Dablet and expose the preview functionality as tooltips for people just to implement one preview at a time. And if we have an extension ecosystem and the browser knows these extensions exist in the store, then it could get to a point where we could smartly look at something, see a property that there's an editor for, and we can recommend this to you in context. So you can install an extension for DevTools right in context and solve the problem as you are there. Now, if these things sound interesting to you, and if you want to build extensions like these, if you're a web designer who wants extensions built for them like this, we are very, very interested in hearing from you. So please reach out to either me or any of my colleagues in Firefox DevTools. We really want to understand what classes of problems you're trying to solve so as to build an API which really serves your needs well. Because we're really interested in building tools that work well for you. Because until we do that, we are always going to introduce some form of limitation in the creative expression you get into DevTools, and we cannot really design in the browser unless we make DevTools for designers actually good. Thank you very much.